In tech circles these days, it's become popular to talk about having a moonshot vision of, kind of like John F. Kennedy's, we're going to reach the moon in 10 years, to kind of catalyze a lot of resources. So I want to talk about a moonshot vision for growth for Christian higher education. So as I talked about previously, there's essentially three possible futures. One is a future, say 2030, where it's basically Google takes over higher education or Microsoft takes over higher education, and it becomes dominated by tech platforms. And there you'd see a 40% decline of Christian higher education. The other one is where state mega universities dominate the future. And again, you would see a 40% decline in Christian higher education. And what I'd like to do is really have a moonshot that looks at how could we get this 400% growth in Christian higher education. Now, one of the things that's important to look at in the higher education market is if you look at diffusion of innovation and you take the concept of a degree as an innovation, right now the degree market penetration globally is only 6.7%. So we actually haven't crossed the chasm, to use Jeffrey Moore's example. And often what happens is the early companies that start something, there's a dramatically different model that launches it. So we haven't really crossed the chasm. The iPhone's a good example. They didn't invent the smartphone, but they crossed the chasm for that. So I would argue that higher education's getting ready to go through that, where you had traditional higher education, and then there's going to be new models for post-secondary education globally. And I would say probably the best new model I've seen out there is Arizona State University. It's probably the most comprehensive, and they have a tiered circles. At the core, they have research, so that's knowledge. The second area is going to be their full immersion on campus. Then the third is going to be what they call digital immersion online. The fourth is really their MOOCs, or massive open online course, and the next tier is education through exploration, technology enhanced. I think that's largely a mass media approach, but there's other approaches. So, and I like that model because it follows the same model that Jesus had. Jesus had the 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John. He had the 12 disciples. He had the 120 disciples. He had the 5,000. And each of those tiers is really important. It's not that one of those tiers is more important than the other. And I think that in terms of a moonshot vision, how do we get to 25 million students? I think we need to have a similar approach. So you start off with this global digital ecosystem. There's billions of people involved in that, and you're going to have a Christian digital ecosystem. And then the next tier is you're going to have Courseware. So you're going to have hundreds of millions of people who are going to be using Courseware, and you're going to have third millennium MOOCs, Christian MOOCs out there. Third millennium has Christian Courseware. And then the next tier, and the idea is that each one of these is going to kind of feed into the other. The next tier is you're going to have alternative credit. So we formed this thing called GC4 as a mechanism to do that. And then the next tier is modular blended education. So that's micro campuses and unbundled models. And there you're going to have maybe 5 to 20 million. And as you go, you get smaller markets, but you're getting more and more intensive, just as Jesus did with his disciples. And then you have at the core on-campus Christian higher education, which I would estimate, globally might be around 5 million. It's a little bit hard to say. So what's the strategy for how do we get there? I'm basically translating that last concentric circle diagram into a pyramid diagram and just saying, we're going to build on the Christian digital ecosystem. We're going to have Christian use of secular platforms. The biggest Christian platform right now digitally is the Bible app with 240 million users. It'll probably have over 1 billion in the next decade or so. There's going to be these Christian subscription services. You might subscribe to watch Christian movies, Christian audio, other things. And then there's going to be new platforms that are kind of hard to even imagine today. Then the next tier, you're going to have Courseware. So that Courseware is going to be free. It's going to include first-year Bible courses. It's going to include Christian integration courses. And it's going to include secular courseware that we're going to rebundle into Christian programs. The next tier is going to be alternative credit. So that's going to be for college, in most cases, years 1 to 3. The average cost is going to be $100 per year, and that's a global average cost. And you're going to build on Christian and secular courseware. And you're going to have different delivery methods, microcampus, online, and mobile delivery. And then you're going to have people who get a bachelor's. So that's going to be average cost of $1,000 a year, full range of university degrees. And then some people will want the more transformative experience that you get through a micro campus. And there the cost is going to be higher. Probably average cost globally is going to be $2,000 per year. And if you take this approach, you're actually going to be able to get to this 25 million student goal and 400% growth. So what's some of the assumptions that go into this model? Well, one of the key assumptions is that 80% or more of the growth of Christian higher education will happen in developing countries. And ultimately what that means is you have to have price points that they can afford. And that's probably the biggest lesson whenever I talk to people that they just don't get. They're used to cost first pricing, and they say, here's how much it costs for my degree, and you're going to pay that. But the alternative is to do price-based pricing, where you say, what can people afford for this new market? Another assumption is that accredited credentials are going to be important to this market in developing countries. If you look at the poor often will dress up for church. They often have to provide stronger signals to the job market. And I think that part of the reason for that is that, if you are poor, you need better signals. And I think that because of that, credentials are going to be important. And the primary growth market, even though it's going to be in developing countries, and I'm using the term poor, it's not going to be the poorest of the poor. It's going to be the middle class. So the emerging middle class, 4.9 billion by 2030, and almost all of which will have affordable broadband access by 2030. So some other design parameters: you need to design for online, mobile, blended, and offline delivery methods. Recognizing that the majority of the growth of Christian higher education will happen in the alternative education ecosystem, as attendance in traditional Christian higher education will only have either decline or have slight growth. Free, open, unbundled courseware will be foundational for growth, and integration between components will be essential. So let me explain the details of what I mean by that. I've showed before this diagram where you're going to have two ecosystems competing. And not entirely competing. I think they're going to be complementary. So you're going to have the traditional bundled, vertically integrated Christian higher education ecosystem of Bible schools, Christian liberal arts colleges, Christian universities, seminaries. Then you're going to have an unbundled ecosystem that's going to build on a base of courseware. Then you're going to have alternative credit mechanisms. You're going to have alternative degree pathways. And then you're going to have, for those who want them, church and ministry microcampuses. And you're going to have, the base is going to be a freemium or donor-based model, and the top is going to be for fee. And this left side is start at a lot of students, 5 million, but it's either going to only grow slightly or decline. Whereas you have this other side that only has a smaller number of students, but could experience 50% to 1,000% growth. So this is how I propose, how do we get to the moonshot? And what's the roadmap? And ultimately this is it. I think what we need is a $5 million funding pilot. And the goal is we need to scale this alternative credit ecosystem. Let's try to get it to 10,000 students. Let's get some measurable metrics. You're talking about $50 per student, and that I want people to be thinking about that price point. And ultimately, here's how I distribute the money, just off the top of my head. I would say, the courseware is foundational, so give $2 million to the courseware providers, and have it tied to outcomes. They need to get 10,000 students in alternative credit programs. Often, courseware providers can focus on what's called vanity metrics, where you try to get millions of people who start MOOCs, but they never finish, and ultimately life change happens in the finish. And the vanity metrics are needed. It's helpful for funders, it's helpful for marketing, but we know that life change happens whenever people actually spend time in this material. So then the alternative credit mechanisms, you would have $1 million to get 2,000 students with credit accepted by Christian institutions, and then have another $1 million to accept these students, and you'd try to get them to have 1,000 degrees completed, so $1,000 per degree. And then you would also have church and ministry micro campuses where you might have 500 students at $2,000 per student. And ultimately what you're able to do is you're able to expand the overall ecosystem. So, key question is, who are the potential funders that could support this vision? Let me go into the next slide and say, why should we take this approach for a funding pilot? And there's several reasons. One is that I believe the most significant gap in terms of doing a gap analysis, what's really needed, it's to get the components of the Christian ecosystem to work together. Most of these models exist somewhere, it's just they're not working together, there aren't solutions. So it's critical to invest in all components of the ecosystem, one, but invest and have outcomes that are driven to encourage people to have connections so that there would be solutions. The other reason why is we need to have a pilot to cross the chasm, to get to mainstream adoption of alternative Christian education. Right now, it's a fledgling market, and really, it's only targeting early adopters. It's not targeting the mainstream. So crossing the chasm means that you can get, mainstream adoption. And to do that, I think what we need to do is we need to conduct lean startup experiments. So figuring out how do you scale this alternative Christian ecosystem. We don't even know what models are going to become the dominant solution. I think that there's going to be some rebundling, and I'll talk about some of the other business models, but we don't know what's going to be the ones that dominate. And one of the quotes I like the best is from Judith Rodin from the Rockefeller Foundations, is solutions to many of the world's most difficult problems don't need to be invented. They only need to be found, funded, and scaled. And my next presentation is going to talk about the business models to do that. But before I go into that presentation, I want to talk about some of the characteristics of an alternative Christian higher education ecosystem that crosses the chasm, because I think it's helpful to have a target. So some of the characteristics I think that are going to be critical. One is you're going to have free courseware, and I want to emphasize that it's going to have to be free. It can be freemium, or it can be donor-based, but ultimately the difference in the digital ecosystem between, say, apps that charge a penny and apps that charge nothing is the difference between having 100 million or 1 billion users and having 0 users, or having a few thousand users. So ultimately that part's going to have to be free, and there's going to be 2 distribution channels. To use business terms, there's the B2C, business to consumer, and that is going to have to be a highly usable mobile first design, probably built on a platform like OpenEdX. The reason why I use that as an example is it's highly usable, it's a mobile friendly platform, and I think there's going to need to be another complementary platform or integration is going to be a B2B, where you're going to have highly usable mechanisms that enable church-centered distribution. Now, I've highlighted in bold a few items here, and the reason why I've highlighted them in bold is if I had the money to work on this myself, where would I invest? And these things that are in bold are probably where I would invest. And there's a group that's actually doing this church-centered distribution. It's Christian University and Christian Certificates out of Our Daily Bread, but their model right now isn't very well unbundled, and it hasn't really been scaled. But I think we need to have multiple mechanisms to do that. The other characteristics are the business model. So you're going to build on free courseware. Ultimately, whoever's going to do this is going to have a long-term sustainable funding model. My guess is globally, there's probably going to be less than 10 major Christian platforms globally. And part of what we're trying to do is get to the platform stage. Now, there's going to be tens of thousands of smaller players that interact with these platforms. But there's probably only going to be 10 of these platforms, and my guess is each of them to become a global player is going to take an investment of $10 to $100 million to achieve critical mass. And it may only be that there's 2 or 3 of these platforms, or in the case of the Bible app basically is the dominant platform, and then there's maybe 2 or 3 others. ultimately, usability is going to require tight integration between layers in an unbundled model. I talk a lot about unbundling, but unbundling by itself is not at all usable. It's like a car that all the parts are taken apart. That's an unbundled car. That's not useful. You need to have it assembled into a solution. So having it rebundled is going to be really important, but we don't know what the dominant business models for rebundling are going to be. There's going to have to be non-credit and for-credit paths in this system. And then on the content side, I think you're going to need to represent, look at Christians globally and the opportunities, for growth of Christians globally, and you're going to have to get content that's going to represent that. So, right now, Third Millennium has, some general content that might have some reform leanings. There really isn't a Pentecostal counterpart to Third Millennium. I think that's a big opportunity. Because of the large global representation of the Pentecostal / charismatic or spirit-filled. You're going to need to get most of the major languages covered. And then the other area where I'd invest is in Christian integration into specific fields to get jobs. Right now we've launched a $5,000 4-year degree program in business. I'd love to do one around technology or computer science. And ultimately, that's going to have to target the majority of the world. My current degree at $5,000, I think, is priced too high for 4 years. I want to get that price down because that's what you're going to need for the majority of the world. So ultimately, I think the key thing of getting a pilot is how do we get a pilot that helps us create platforms and examples that is going to help us get to an ecosystem that crosses the chasm. So in the next presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the business models of how we can do that.